Okay, hello to everybody who's listening and watching us. This is a fantastic event with many interesting sessions going on, the Global Forum on Democratizing Work. And I'm especially happy to be chairing this particular session. My name is Dani Rodrik. I'm an economist, and I'm particularly interested in this session because I think, as an economist, there are certain blind spots
I can't hear you
we have that I hope this session is going to help illuminate. Economists are supposed to be experts on markets and how markets work, but in at least two respects, we ignore some of the important features of markets. One is that markets are based on a system of laws and institutions and practices that we often neglect at our peril, don't understand the dependence of markets as they exist on this background of legal institutions and rules, and sometimes informal practices that are extremely important for their functioning, such as trust. And the other big blind spot is that even when we recognize the importance of legal institutions for the creation and sustenance and thriving of markets, we tend to associate markets with a single set of institutions, as if a market is just a single thing, that it doesn't come in different kinds of forms. And I think that sort of narrows down and constrains our imagination and our thinking about what's feasible. I think these issues are particularly important in a period of rapid technological change and the gig economy. And I think we're very lucky that we have three panelists in this session who've thought very long and hard about these issues, and I really look forward to their comments. We will go in alphabetical order. I'm going to introduce them very briefly now, and then I'll let them go for 10 minutes each, and then we'll open it up to discussion both among the panelists as well as the audience. As you listen to the presenters, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in under the Q&A box should be on the right-hand side of your screen. I'll be moderating that. Our speakers, if I sort of were to tell you all about them, that's interesting and important, it would take the whole session, so I'll introduce them very briefly. Our first speaker will be Raul Carillo, who's the Deputy Director of the Law and Political Economy Project, as well as an Associate Research Scholar at Yale Law School. He's also an affiliate of the NYU Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies. And his work focuses on money as a technology and finance as a mode of governance. He will be followed by Rohan Gray, who is an assistant professor at Willamette University, in finance, including digital fiat currency, as well as broader issues of law and political economy. And finally, we will have Sanjukta Paul, who's an assistant professor of law at Wayne State University, and her work focuses on how law organizes economic coordination in core areas such as labor and employment, antitrust, and corporations, and how these legal choices promote or undermine broader social aims. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Raul, 10 minutes each. Looking forward to it.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Rodrik. I'm really happy to be here. As was mentioned, my core subject matter of study is finance and technology. What I'm going to try to do to situate the conversation about tech and work more generally is talk a little bit about research that is going on under the broader auspices of the Law and Political Economy Project with respect to the LPE, the Law and Political Economy of Tech, and how our economy is organized by technology. So over at the LPE project, we try to think of technology in terms of its substance rather than just its instrumental value and its place in broader systems, and that's broader legal systems and social systems as well. And the work that is going on in the research of LPE scholars has tended toward a particular perspective. My personal opinion is that this is best embodied in the work of LPE faculty director Amy Kapczynski and Julie Cohen at Georgetown. And this body of work essentially says that industrial production or even financial management are not necessarily the centers of our economy as time goes on. Much of economic exchange is defined by relationships that can't be characterized as the same kind of market relationships that we had before, to Professor Rodrik's point. Instead, markets are increasingly defined by platform power, by companies that gather information about other companies and about users in order to get more data, to get more users, to get more data, to get more users, and to match people for particular purposes, to score people compared to each other, and to divine insights from data sets that were not possible before computerized mass surveillance. To the perspective of the human mind with this new technology, there's simply too much information to process, yet it is what is increasingly defining our economy. As Frank Pasquale argues, this necessarily involves further trust of robots as opposed to humans in certain spheres of life. We see that readily in terms of labor and employment, with things like HireVue, which was intended to use facial recognition analysis and other sorts of new technologies in order to give someone a score as to how hireable they are, and has, according to most scholars, wound up being biased, discriminatory, and sort of structurally disadvantageous to exactly the people it's supposed to help. So overall, these platforms are being integrated into everything, and the technologies are being integrated into law more broadly. When you use a platform, whether it's Amazon or Netflix, you're subscribing to a set of protocols. And those protocols relate to data security, your privacy, the data storage, sharing, etc. There have been about 4,000 known breaches of the international financial system within the last 10 years, with Equifax being only the most obvious. Furthermore, powerful players will use the data for nefarious purposes. The key thing here is that data is necessarily social. When we give up data, or we are forced to generate more data, perhaps because we work for Amazon and we're being monitored 24/7, so we work farther, faster, better, smarter, apparently, we are necessarily generating information about ourselves that is not really governed by federal data security or privacy law now. People like to say that technology has outstripped the law. At LPE, we like to say the technology has changed and co-constitutes the law. Overall, though, we're being increasingly defined by these datification tools, and that's very apparent, especially when you start thinking about work. Advantageous data can be underproduced. Many people look to more scoring models to be fairer than the average human. There is, for instance, a literature about Afrofuturism and the idea that new technologies will actually help make the workplace, for instance, more fair. This has not borne out thus far. So harmful data is advantageous data is underproduced, but harmful data is also overproduced. And if you're a person of color in the society, that data is sloshing around between your boss, between the cops, between the feds, between just other corporations who are trying to sell you targeted ads that might actually discriminate against you in a targeted fashion. This is a very fraught thing that is happening. In the context of work, in many ways, these dynamics that being watched are not new. It's a central concept of the factory. Marx feared a future where the place of the slave driver's lash would be overtaken by the overlooker's book of penalties. And he was just thinking about the ledger system at that point. But now what is changing is this mode of surveillance and the insights that are driven from watching someone at the workplace. LPE scholars talk about how this is at the center of the process of creating markets themselves, most obviously with the gig economy. Jason Jackson talks about how this is part of a broader effort to seize control of public space, especially urban spaces. If you go up and down the turnpike in New Jersey, where I live, for instance, you will see that Amazon is eating towns. And this is an entire process that includes cashlessness, in terms the Uberification of the economy generally, but there is a lot that is going on at once to control workers' lives in a company town sense, even beyond just creating the markets within which they work. Brishan Rogers at the LBE project has dedicated a lot of time to talking about how technology can punish workers as a class. This is most obvious when the data that is generated under employment is used to automate things. But again, there is still the whip, and there is still the idea that you can maximize the efficiency of a worker. And then this is used to classify people in different kinds of working relationships. Vina Dubal gives an excellent example of how Proposition 22 created new categories of workers defined by in many cases, the technological relationship with the company. And this has led to further racial stratification. If you go back and look at the Prop 22 battles, you'll see that Uber would claim that to oppose it would be racist because so many drivers are immigrants of color, etc. And you see a reconstruction of social hierarchies that is happening due to the datification of the economy and the central ways in which information is becoming paramount. If you want another good case study on this, I'd recommend a book called Data Driven by Karen Levy about truck drivers and how that informal industry was turned into something increasingly formalized. A complement book to that is Semi-Queer by Anne Belay, which talks about how the automation and the formalization of the trucker industry has ceased to make it a safe haven for certain kinds of people working in certain parts of the economy. I know I'm going on a lot, so more broadly, I'll just say, teeing up Rowan, that there are a lot of financial technologies that are embedded in our current labor practices in ways we don't necessarily understand. Early direct deposit, early access wages are categories that are defined by the technology that is used and evade regulatory controls and consumer protections. Nikita Catino refers to this as fringe tech. All these financial products are aimed at people of color in most parts, and banking the unbanked and developing a certain kind of narrative. In a more mundane sense, apps and increasingly all kinds of credit products are also used just in the very payment of wages. It is now illegal in New York City to pay somebody without or not offer an electronic option, a non-electronic option of payment, because of these concerns about how this information is all used. So that's just what is in the background. I hope that we can move to a better data system, a better work system, a better financial system that underlies both. And with that, I'm going to turn to Rowan for some affirmative proposals. Thank you.
Thank you, Raul. Looks like Raul set you up, Rowan, for where we go from here.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here with everybody and with my co-panelists and to Professor Rodrik for moderating. Building on what Raul was talking about, and also from Professor Rodrik's sort of initial remarks about sort of the limits of markets and even what kinds of markets we're talking about, I'm going to sort of want to use just a basic kind of Polanyi framework, not all of his ideas, but just to sort of pick up that idea of kind of where are places where markets logic doesn't even give us a particularly useful starting point, even within the contemporary framework. And I think there are three obvious answers that I want to go into. One is labor itself, one is money itself, and one is land. But in this context, I want to talk about that in the context of intellectual property. We often talk about kind of monetary mediation in the context of markets. You think of markets, you think of things where there is things being bought and sold and there's money flowing around. But the reality is that there are all kinds of production systems that have monetary logics to them that involve money that wouldn't really match anything that we would consider a market, and certainly not the kind of stylized markets that we often hear of in economics. And this kind of thing is obviously true, whether you're talking about divorce law, that I used to, work in that area, or nowadays the kind of boundaries of what we might consider paid work have become, increasingly blurry to the point where, the same platform that you share pictures of your dog or your breakfast is also the platform that you may be renting or buying things in a marketplace or pushing a brand that's then going to get advertising revenue. But where that kind of impacts with labor, I think, in a really interesting way is that in the past, the idea that you're getting paid to produce something or getting paid to sell your labor power was at least conceptually relatively easy for people to understand. You turn up at the factory or you turn up on a farm and you do the work and you leave. And what you're doing when you're there is the value. But in a world where, as Raul was saying, the data that gets generated within those processes and the data that you generate simply by being a person has value, then the question of what we're actually paying someone as a worker to do or for becomes less clear. You know, on one hand, we're paying someone to do the labor itself, but on another hand, we're paying for access to the data that gets generated by them and for even just the right to put them within a system of surveillance and of data mining. And that allows us, at least in my opinion, to zoom out and to really ask a sort of much more fundamental question that goes to the reconceptualization of work that a lot of MMT economists have been trying to sort of push for a while, which is we can come up with all different sorts of theories of value, different theories of productivity, different theories of just desserts and deservingness. And we can look at different eras of history where there were different modes of production that were dominant and see the differences between different kinds of labor. But there's a sort of formal layer at which we can understand paid work as simply something that somebody gets paid by somebody else for. And we can add more substance to that depending on your views, but at a very superficial level, in the economy right now, someone that, according to a lot of people, might not add any value, and someone that adds a lot of value, the former might be considered employed or getting paid to work, and the latter might not be. And the distinction is not about whether or not those theories of value are correct, but something much more formalistic, which is just whether they're getting paid and what kind of legal relationship that payment is occurring under, whether it's, you know, a tip jar on a social media platform or a wage relationship, or, you know, getting some sort of app mediated payment directly from a final consumer or something. But if we start from this idea that anything that we're willing to pay someone money to do could at least presumptively be work, could be work in the formal sense that we recognize as labor and bring into the labor system, then I think that allows us to ask a much broader question of what are the things in life that we want to recognize with monetary value? What are the things that we want to pay people, and in doing so recognize as socially valuable to keep producing through the wage or through the cash mediated nexus? And in a world where there's a lot of concern about the environment, there's a lot of concern about the future of entire industries after COVID and everything else, starting from that conception allows us to then kind of ask, what is the actual value coming out of, for example, a contract where you get paid a wage to produce knowledge goods, and then your employer gets to own those knowledge goods forever under a work for hire doctrine. In the past, it may have been that employer has access to scarce machinery. The printing press is expensive to create, or they have access to a lab that has resources, and so part of the benefit is that you get access to those resources. But in the modern world, that kind of work for hire doctrine ends up becoming a way essentially to just reallocate the value of the output of people in ways where there's no necessary relationship to productivity or to marginal benefit or anything like that, but simply just a reflection of the power relationships of those platforms. You know, when people write sort of, you know, film scripts for Marvel or something like that, you know, and then they earn $1 billion out there. We're not talking about a reflection of their underlying value. We're talking about the bargaining power of those workers versus Marvel is the only thing determining exactly how much goes to different, factors in that process. And then if, for example, the Supreme Court chooses to extend the copyright extension by another 20 years, that radically changes the value proposition in that market that has nothing to do with the relative inputs of the different actors there and everything to do with theories of the benefit of copyright law, which requires us to actually look at the history of why those laws were created and whether they actually match our current system. So that's the first thing, is to think of, unemployment and conversely employment as a monetary phenomenon, as a question of who creates money, for whom, for what purposes. And as we're rethinking the macro and monetary dimension of the economy, to think of unemployment and even things like intellectual property regimes as part of a monetary theory, Do we want a monetary system where the money primarily goes into people's pockets to work? And if so, what are the channels that we've created to do that to the widest ranges of possibly socially valuable work? But also, if we think of ourselves all as knowledge workers, right? We're not all just doing sort of manual labor or other kinds of industries, but we're all data generating subjects now. Then whose data is that? What is the value of that knowledge? How do we create social structures that protect that knowledge and protect the people within it? And we're seeing this sort of debate manifest on one hand with, you know, everything from Sci-Hub and LibGen and this debate over academic publishing and the sort of broken incentive structure of entities like Elsevier, all the way through to things like COVID. But the last kind of issue I want to talk about, in addition to sort of money and sort of land in that broader sense of sort of natural resources like knowledge and information and data, is about the monetary system itself. Because if work really is that thing that we get paid to do, then that allows us a framework to explain how nowadays a lot of people's work takes place in their bedroom. It takes place in their home. It takes place not in an employment space, but in the exact same spaces that they're sleeping and you know, spending time with their loved ones. And the difference is that there's a little, you know, red light that goes on, and now they're trying to earn money. But that boundary that might have been more geographic in the past has faded away. And now we really need to look at what it means when money is mediating spaces that may have historically been less, or at least less explicitly monetarily mediated. And at least my kind of final point, which I want to kind of, you know, harp on, and this goes to what Raul was leading into, is the technology of the money itself then becomes a really crucial part for defining those spaces. If you are, for example, trying to be a sex worker and you can't get access to a payment system that allows you to send digital payments because the banks decided that kind of work is you know, imprudent or something, or improper, and the only way that you could theoretically get those monies would be through cash transactions. That's very different for somebody who does sex work in person versus who does it remotely. The remote kind of work requires remote payments to be viable. And similarly, if you are somebody who is used to accepting, you know, cash payments, or is dealing with work that doesn't actually you don't want to have a record that people can use against your customers, whether that's, you know, somebody who is organizing African-American agitators in a racist city in the South, or anything else, then the very infrastructure of money itself is going to constrain the kinds of work dynamics that you can create, the kinds of remuneration that you can have. And whether that is allowing us to access digital finance, even if you're on the margins, or whether that's how much information is actually being generated in the act of payment that then goes into this larger data generation subject. Whether or not, you know, by the act of making payments, we're also kind of being a site of value generation for the financial institutions that we rely on, means that we have to really think about, you know, what it would mean to pay people money to do useful work in the future, and to think about the best way to take that output and you know, manifest it for the broader social benefit. And I think that requires understanding the technological aspects underneath all of those things that go very far beyond the kind of logic of standard markets. So I'll end there and hand over to Sanjukta, who I'm sure can go into further detail about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Ron. Sanjukta?
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with all of you. Thank you so much for the introduction, Professor Rodrik. And actually picking up on, so I'm going to talk about antitrust and the organization of work and economic democracy. And I think if we think about what Professor Rodrik said in his introduction about the importance of legal and social institutions in structuring markets, in setting up markets, I think this leads us quite directly to a reframing of what perhaps our initial notions of the role of antitrust in an agenda of democratizing work, the theme of this conference. So I think sometimes we tend to think of antitrust as something that deals with, you know, perhaps with these big tech companies or other, you know, just other sort of massive firms in the economy, which is certainly part of what it does, or just sort of like maintaining free markets at the margins, right? But if you engage in this reframing of what markets are and their relationship to law, then I think this also really changes how we look at antitrust and the role of antitrust in this broader agenda, right? Because I think that, the way I've come to think about antitrust law is that it is our generalist law of market construction. Many areas of law construct markets, right? I mean, everything from corporations to labor law to specific areas of law and, particular domain areas, consumer protection law, but, many, many others. But antitrust, in a way, is the generalist and catch-all area of law that constructs and polices I actually don't love that word because it makes it seem like there's a pre-existing sort of ideal that we're policing, but it's the generalist sort of law of market construction is how I've sort of come to think of it. And so it's not about setting up these fictive free markets, and it's not about sort of maintaining a self-regulating or self-coordinating market, which I would argue is not possible, that we always have, that economic coordination is ubiquitous. It's essential to market functioning, and law has a central role in selecting and constructing, supporting, discouraging, prohibiting particular forms of market coordination, particular market coordination mechanisms. And I think this is really fundamental, and I think is itself kind of a challenge to the independent analytic coherence of a self-coordinating market ideal, ultimately, although I won't primarily focus on that issue. Perhaps we'll get into it in the Q&A. I think that as well, there can be sometimes a folk version of the neoclassical textbook ideal of a functioning market that encourages us generally to think of antitrust law this way, as sort of, helping to create and maintain self-coordinating markets. So, all right, so I'm just going to take it as a given for purposes of this presentation. You can certainly challenge me on this, but that we're moving beyond that, right? And so if we move beyond that, then democratic forms of economic coordination, so the theme of this conference is democracy, economic democracy. I think democratic forms of economic coordination become really essential, not as sort of correctives, they are also, of course, have normative content, but not as an initial matter, just as normative correctives to a free market ideal. But once this free market ideal is sort of not independently analytically coherent, then it becomes essential as a way of maintaining markets. If markets are not self-coordinating, if law is always choosing coordination mechanisms, then really we have to make a choice, and we can sort of either choose more hierarchical economic forms of market coordination with less egalitarian outcomes, or we can choose more democratic economic processes with more egalitarian outcomes, and then there can be different permutations of those two things as well, right? But I think that this is important in terms of sort of laying the conceptual groundwork of what we're talking about here. So I will say, and just to motivate this point a little bit more, but also to get more concrete, mainstream law and economics actually also noticed the indispensability of economic coordination, but they took it in a very different direction. So, decades and decades ago, Ronald Coase noticed that there is economic coordination happening in business firms all the time. I'm sure that in other panels of this conference that you have talked about business firms, and there are people here who discuss democratizing the corporation, which I think becomes actually continuous with the antitrust enterprise in various ways once we recognize this ubiquity of economic coordination. At any rate, in sort of mainstream economics, so this was also noticed, although it was theorized a little bit differently. The idea was that the firm becomes necessary because market failures are inevitable in these various ways, and so the firm steps into that breach and also is a solution to transaction costs, right? And really fundamental to this account, I'm skipping over a lot, but fundamental to this account is that hierarchy becomes the preferred mode of economic coordination. So people often don't pay as much attention to the fact that in Coase's classic paper, The Nature of the Firm, master-servant law was very, very important. He took, as a background, assumption, essentially, that sort of common law, master-servant law, is operative, and that this, and indeed has come into existence to solve these these problems of transaction costs. And so what we have is actually can be a bit of a just so story type explanation, right? But that the forms of law that we actually have are efficient solutions to coordination problems, essentially, right? And then this becomes an implicit justification for the hierarchy inside the firm. I want to skip ahead a little. There's obviously a lot more to say here in terms of how this thought developed, but Oliver Williamson and others in the 1960s took up the Coasian tradition and really had a profound influence on antitrust law by extending transaction cost analysis. And this really had a quite direct effect on the case law. And the case law I'm going to briefly talk about is the case law of vertical restraints. And I want to briefly say how this functioned in the mid-century period, and then how it changed, and then how this points forward for further reform. So under the influence of sort of this expanded transaction cost theory, what essentially happened is that the hierarchy that Coase theorized to be efficient, operationally efficient within the firm, was extended beyond the firm. So in a sense, the point that Williamson and others made is that even in contracting relationships beyond the firm, these same issues of transaction costs arise. And I'm paraphrasing and translating, but that essentially hierarchy is also a solution to transaction costs beyond the firm. I think that you can see where this is going. Once this had an influence on the law, right, this really enables the creation of the gig economy. So we think of the gig economy as a problem of labor law, as a problem of the scope of employee status, but antitrust has had this critical role, and it's had a critical role in a way that's connected to some of the foundational assumptions about sort of how to think about economic coordination, I think, in the mainstream tradition. So let me break that down just a tiny bit. So once hierarchy beyond the firm is theorized to be operationally efficient, this becomes a counterweight to the value of horizontal competition, which was already sort of accepted in mid-century antitrust law, right? So, I mean, we may have other issues with that, put that aside for the moment, right? But that was something that was accepted. Another thing that's very important, mid-century antitrust law certainly already was allied with neoclassical price theory, but also explicitly recognized normative goals that cannot obviously be cognized within that conceptual framework, namely non-domination. So this is something that is, deep in the legislative history of sort of the foundational antitrust statutes, but this is also something that the mid-century courts recognized, and they as a value that antitrust law is pursuing, in addition to promoting horizontal competition, right? And so this is actually really important because it's one of their justifications for policing vertical restraints. What do I mean by vertical restraints? I mean precisely that exercise of control or domination beyond firm boundaries. So what a franchisor is doing with a franchisee when they have, contracts that set prices, that set supply levels, that, do all of these sorts of things that we typically think of doing inside the firm, and which is really taken to its logical conclusion in the gig economy, where Uber is, telling drivers what prices to charge for, these putatively independent services that are offered on an open market, right? And this is not something that would have been possible under mid-century antitrust law. I think it's really important to take that in, right? So really, I think the modern business format, franchising economy, and the gig economy as we know it is not possible under mid-century antitrust law because of this policing of vertical restraints, which occurs on both on the basis of a legal rationale of sort of neoclassical price theory, but also of non-domination. What happens with the transformation of antitrust, in the Chicago School Revolution, is that the non-domination concern that can't be cognized in the neoclassical framework is effectively deleted. and the transaction cost analysis, the emphasis on operational efficiency within that framework, is elevated above sort of maintaining horizontal competition. Okay, so, and it's extended beyond firm boundaries. So I feel like I'm probably coming close to the end of my time, so I want to try to wrap this up. This is important not only because these changes then create the gig economy that we talk about, but also because they point back to the possibility of doing something, to point back and forward. In mid-century antitrust law, not only was there a recognized rationale of promoting non-domination and maintaining non-domination, but also this functionally worked to promote democratic coordination, the thing that I sort of started out talking about, and that is the theme of this conference. Why? Not because the courts recognize this explicitly in the mid-century era in the US, obviously I should have clarified I'm talking about here, but rather because in tandem with affirmative labor law, a non-domination rationale that contained domination within the boundaries of the firm, where horizontal coordination rights provided by labor law would apply, in that broader legal context, antitrust did work to promote democratic coordination. I can't say, does that make sense? Because I can't see anyone, but I hope that made sense. What happens then when antitrust recedes from that goal is that now the exercise of domination is able to occur in spaces where no other area of law is providing for horizontal coordination rights. Counterparties outside the firm cannot get together to coordinate. Not only is there not a framework promoting their collective bargaining or collective action, but in fact, antitrust itself will police that as anti-competitive, right? So together, these are the huge changes in legal architecture that literally make the gig economy possible, and again, point to a way in which antitrust can not only accommodate, but actually promote democratic coordination. So I'll close on the note of how antitrust can actually not just, we can go beyond restoring sort of in the US, often we have this conversation about restoring the mythical New Deal era, which extends into the mid-century, but actually, we can do more, because if you go further back in the antitrust tradition, in fact, there's precedent for actively promoting democratic coordination. So the FTC can become, for example, a vehicle not just for making rules about fair and unfair competition, very important, right? But also for actually promoting democratic coordination in particular markets and sectors, channeling business rivalry away from competition on lowering labor costs, which we know leads to sweatshop conditions, which is not good for workers at all, right? Channeling it away from that into socially beneficial forms of business rivalry, but also actively potentially promoting economic coordination. And so I think I'm at the end. So I just want to say that there's a precedent for this in the vision for the Federal Trade Commission. It never was fully actualized, but we can think about this, I think, in projects of reform now, and sort of actively allying with agencies that are responsible for labor coordination, because ultimately, we need to have workers and business at the table if we're going to democratically coordinate markets. And ultimately, I think that this also has to be connected with democratically coordinating the firm internally. So I'll end there.
Thank you. Thank you all. So there's lots out here to discuss, and again, a reminder to those who are watching or listening to us. I see at least one question in the Q&A. I want to come. Maybe I'll start with that because it's just a clarification. The question is to Raul. Can you elaborate on what you mean by Amazon swallowing towns in New Jersey?
Sure thing. So New Jersey is just the vantage point I happen to have. But my point was that the platform power is often exercised in a broader process of gentrification. It brings a technocratic approach to everything that is focused, I'd argue, on many of the concepts that were central in Sanjukta's presentation. Thoughts about how businesses should operate, etc. But it brings that model of development and that approach to social life with it wherever it goes. When I was living in Queens, actually, the sort of canary in the coal mine to Amazon HQ2 coming was that the local bodegas were disappearing and the jobs along with them, and a different class of people was coming in with cashless stores and different sorts of businesses that were, operated by broader change. So when we talk about big tech increasingly having control over labor, to one of Rowan's broader points, this sort of power is not just situated in labor, it's part of a broader network of things that I think subjugate the working class as a whole, as well as other groups in society.
Thank you. I wonder if I could ask all the panelists a question about the notion of democratizing, extending beyond democratizing the workplace, the firm, and democratizing, or at least making market competition fairer, but also democratizing the direction of innovation and technological change. Because one interpretation of what is happening today is that the particular structures we have and the particular incentives we have that motivates technological change is one that puts new innovation, or at least generates innovation in a particular direction that is not very friendly to workers or to ordinary people. So firms spend a lot of money on surveillance and gathering data from people and their workers. A lot less resources are spent on technology creation, the sort of learning of workers on the job and making the jobs better and more fulfilling. So there is a lot of flexibility in principle in the way that innovation and technology could go, but what always seems to have gone in a direction that leaves people out. So I guess the question is what's the role of law in regarding the directional change in a way that would be more friendly to ordinary people and to workers, instead of essentially doing it imperfect, in a kind of roundabout way by targeting, let's say, antitrust law or competition law, or by through employment law. Does anybody want to take this on?
Professor Rodrik, I don't know if I'm the only one that had a really hard time hearing you, especially at the very end. I think I caught most of it, but.
May I also suggest that Professor Rodrik turns off its camera?
Yeah, and maybe speak further into the mic because it was choppy, I think.
Okay. Let me instead. Can you hear me now? Can you? Okay. Let me turn my video off. Can you hear me better now?
I think it is better. Let's try that.
Well, let me take one question from the audience. Store's book, The Code of Capital, that one many lawyers, law scholars side with capital. How could the legal profession be moved to build markets that work for workers? What kind of changes might be needed in the legal profession?
I'm happy to answer, but
No,
Sanjukta,
go
if you
ahead.
want to go first. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So I think, and to go to your to Professor Rodrik's other question as well. I think when it comes to building these things, the first question we need to sort of start with is, how ambitious are our demands? How much do we want to actually ask for, and sort of reorient the discussion on a different starting point? I think Sanjukta's point that, for example, that antitrust is a general theory of these kinds of spaces is ambitious in a sense that it requires us to really look at a lot of other questions through a new lens. And one of the reasons why, for example, for me, the idea of a job guarantee is so powerful is not because I want to get into quibbling fights about one particular program design or another. Reasonable minds will always disagree, but because it puts the future of work on the same footing as, for example, the future of education in the mid-1800s. Do we want a world where, as John Dewey said, the first great demand of a better social order is the guarantee of the right to every individual who's capable to work, not merely to sort of engage in, back-breaking activity, breaking stones or something, but productive work which a self-respecting person may engage with interest and with more than just pecuniary profit. If that's a world that we want to build, then we can start thinking about what it would take to build that and the legal institutions that we would need. If somebody said today, hey, we're going to take every child at the age of 4 and we're going to teach them to read, we're going to teach them how to develop skills, we're going to teach them how to socialize with other people, we're going to teach them a shared history, and we're going to do that in buildings that are going to be in every town across the whole country. And we're going to source the people who are going to teach that from the local community. People would say today, that's crazy. Have you met the government? The government can't do anything like that. Where are the market actors in that? Where's the profit incentive in that? But once it's there, once it's normalized, it becomes second nature and nobody wants to get rid of it. And so when it comes to building a better democratic, workforce and democratic economy, I think the starting point is, who gets to be part of it? And if we're building a system where by design 5% of people are excluded, or even more than that if you're from certain backgrounds, then at very best, you're going to fail at what you're trying to achieve. And if we want to build it that other way, then we need to start with some pre-analytic commitments. We need to not be starting from the assumption that if the institution doesn't work on day one, then the underlying motivation was a failure. I can point to plenty of bad schools and nobody would say that that's an argument against universal public education. And yet that seems to be the way that we treat, jobs, for example. And when it comes to innovation, I think the same thing. Right now, we've normalized an intellectual property regime, for example, or an innovation regime where the presumption is that it's private market actors that have to lead the charge, and that the best way to remunerate people is to let them have these sort of absolute monopolies or near absolute monopolies for extended periods of time over the output of their work, which they then, of course, then sell on to their employer immediately and never actually retain claims in any way. And whether it's something like academic publishing or other areas where we're investing a huge amount of public money, the idea that once we invest public money, it should be available as a commons on the other side for everybody to draw from, I think is again a pretty powerful reframing, reorientation of our starting point. And given how much people are willing to produce and things when they get an opportunity, I think, unleashing that, whether it's the, WPA's arts programs or, some sort of higher education rehiring of huge numbers of people would be extremely powerful. We just have to be willing to be ambitious enough to demand those things. And the lawyers need to know that they can do this, that these are issues that certain kinds of lawyers should care about, not just the ones who want to work for corporate clients.
Professor Paul, do you want to comment on this? Professor Paul, do you want to comment on this? Or there's also another question that I think might be directed to you about
sure,
how could antitrust law be used to democratize business organizations?
Yeah. So I think that a couple of quick points. So I think that, as I said briefly when I was speaking, I think that once you see economic coordination throughout markets, right? So you don't have this view that economic coordination just happens within firms, and it's, you know, in markets, all we have is competition, right? That, I think, is the sort of unstated premise that allows us to separate antitrust law and corporate law as cleanly, although it's not that clean, but, you know, as cleanly as we claim to, right? But of course, it turns out that that's not the case at all. You know, that antitrust law is, you know, I've argued elsewhere that antitrust law is constantly deciding on forms of economic coordination beyond firm boundaries, right? And one big thing it's doing is effectively choosing, at the broad level, it's effectively choosing vertical, more hierarchical forms of coordination over horizontal, potentially more democratic forms of coordination. I just taught a mini course in which a student came to that conclusion on his own, and it was very, very exciting. I like had an aha moment in the middle of class, and anyway, and so I think that this is occurring, right? And this actually extends into the firm itself, because it turns out that antitrust law has its own conception of the firm. It doesn't just accept what corporation says. If it did, right, then any cartel could simply file articles of incorporation with their state or with the state of Delaware, right? And because we know we have incorporation as of right at this point in our current corporate law regime, we did not always have that in the 19th century, right? But we have incorporation as of right. So if it were the case that antitrust law simply deferred to corporations law, then a cartel, a group of gig workers, you know, whatever it might be, could, and I think that there's some gray areas there with the group of gig workers, actually a potential that could be pushed, which maybe I'll mention briefly. But in general, let's just take something that would be considered a cartel under current antitrust law. They could incorporate, and that would be it. We're a firm. The coordination's taking place within firm boundaries. There, you know, antitrust has what I call the firm exemption. We think of the exemptions to antitrust law as the labor exemption, certain exemptions for cooperatives, the state action exemption, and, you know, certain other specified exemptions. But in fact, the biggest exemption in antitrust law is the unstated one, the firm exemption. It turns out there is law that polices that, because if there weren't, again, we would just, anyone could incorporate, and then we would have like no functioning antitrust law at all, right? And so this is really, when I was sort of like figuring out this critique, this is really the area of doctrine I decided to look at, because this is where it's really unfolding at the right in a nitty-gritty way. And so it turns out, so there is case law on this. It's called the law of the single entity doctrine, and there's going to be versions in other legal systems as well, but in the US that's what it's called. And it sort of, you know, effectively says what in various situations that have arisen, you know, typically the facts have presented not in the types of situations we're most interested in, which is, you know, building democratic forms of organization, but they're still relevant to us. They've come up mostly where different corporations are setting up another corporation through which they're going to do something, right? Like a joint venture, and they incorporate to do that. But it's still very relevant to these alternative forms of organization we want to build. So it turns out in that case law, courts have generally looked for centers of operational control. They've looked effectively for concentrated control. So I don't think that this is all very conscious, but as a whole, what the legal system is then doing is saying that what we look for, what is a firm, is a center of concentrated control. That, of course, is the kind of the opposite of what we want to do if we want to democratize economic coordination, if we want to democratize work, if we want to democratize firms, and we want to democratize markets, right? So I think that we have to trouble that accepted axiom in the law, and we have to really think about this consciously. And I mean, and by the way, not saying that there shouldn't, you know, that it should all be one person, one vote, and not at all. But that in fact, when we dig within the law that we have the opposite assumptions. We need to expose that, and then as Rowan was saying, we have the power to change these things, right? Once you don't have sort of this fictive free market that then has these unstated legal rules that no one's actually thinking about, right, in the background, once we make those explicit and we no longer think that there's this free market benchmark, right, that governs law somehow, effectively what that benchmark is doing is blessing the unstated background legal rules. That's what it's doing, because it doesn't actually make any sense on its own. It's always assuming background forms of coordination. So really what we're doing by invoking this free market ideal, in a sense, or saying that law is, taking its guidance from this independent social science, is that we're blessing the things we don't realize we're already doing, right? So if we expose those, then as Rowan is saying, and Raul is also saying, we can legislate about this. We can also move this from sort of obscure court doctrine that lawyers barely read to the more democratic forms of government, to ask, to the objects of legislation, and potentially, as I was saying, of agency governance that actually involves citizen participation in various ways. So I hope that was responsive. I mean, I think that in this altered view, democratizing firms isn't really a separate project from democratizing markets. There isn't this clean separation between them anymore. I mean, we may, for convenience, choose to, more actively promote democratic forms of coordination within corporate law as well. But I think antitrust law already has a lot to say about this. And then the final thing that I think I would say, I do think there's some potential, even in existing law, for more creatively using the corporate form, for groups of workers using the corporate form to effectively insulate forms of coordination that don't immediately fall within, sort of under existing U.S. labor law, at least. I realize this is very U.S. focused, but also don't fall within sort of the traditional conception of the firm. And I think there's actually room for practical activity here, because I think that there's gray areas in the law in various ways, and I think that is a potential strategy that could be looked at. Professor Rodrik, we can't hear you at all now. At least I can't.
No, I can't either. Maybe you could type it.
Sorry.
Also, yeah, apologies.
Love to hear your follow-up.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Apologies for the tech difficulties, Dani. Thank you for moderating. It was a fantastic panel. And have a good night, everyone. Join us. The sessions continue. The day is not over. So please look at the schedule on the sessions button. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the conference.